Excellent. Well, good afternoon and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris. I'm lead pastor here at Hoboken Grace, and I'm really excited to be back after being out for a week and being able to speak into this conversation, Heroes. Now, before we get there, I just want to talk about one other thing. Throughout the last month, I've just been celebrating this. Do you guys realize the first song that we sang today that we wrote? And there's so much of this that's happening, and we don't get to talk about it very much, but it's just amazing to see how our arts team is creating and everything that they make possible. Because it's not just about what's happening here, but there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of people who every Sunday and throughout the week are watching our services online from all over the world. And all of that is made possible because of our production team and our arts team and all of those who serve in those ways. And I just want to bring that up because I know some of you, you're still observers here at Hoboken Grace. You're not participants. So you come and you observe what's happening and you're a part of our services, but you're not actually part of the mission yet and part of the team. And you're looking, okay, how do I get connected? How do I get involved? A great way to do that is through our arts team, whether it's you're a musician or even if you're not, but you love music and you love computers, those types of things. That's a great way for you to get started. If you're interested in that, you can just stop by the production booth. You say, I've never done it before. It's okay. They can train you in that, and you can be part of just all that they're creating and all the ways that they're impacting people around the world. I just encourage you to check that out. If nothing else, just to see what they do and how they do it. You get to see some of it up here on stage, and sometimes maybe you turn around and you see what's happening in the dark booth back there, but there's even people over here in the secret closet that are doing the live stream mix. It's really cool, all the different ways that they serve and all the different things that are made possible because of them. But again, I'm really excited to be able to speak into this Heroes series. Anthony kind of gave us a teaser for this a couple of weeks ago, and then last week he picked it back up, and we've been looking at this really powerful passage in Hebrews chapter 11 where it walks through this list of individuals who were significant in faith, who lived significant lives of faith. And we've been looking at, okay, how did they live lives of faith and how do we live in light of their story, which is really what this is all about. As a matter of fact, when you get to our memory verse, which is the beginning of chapter 12, it says this. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge cloud of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race that God has set before us. The entire point of this passage is, okay, how do we live in light of those who've come before us? How do we engage faith in light of the faith that we see in the lives of those who have come before us? And today the plan was for us to be able to walk through another story. We've seen some pretty powerful story. We looked at Joseph's story and we saw how he had the faith to believe that God was for him even when everything was against him. And we looked at Rahab's story last week and we saw that she had the faith to believe in God's grace even when no one else did. And the plan was today to be able to tackle another one of those stories from Hebrews chapter 11. But there's something that I want to be able to speak into before we get there. Because as we talk about faith, one of the things that's really important is that we understand what faith is. And I think for a lot of us, we have a very different idea or definition of faith than God does. And because of that, if we don't reconcile that, if we don't understand what God's talking about when he talks about faith, I think it will really, it undermines all that we're trying to do as far as living in light of those who've come before us. So I want to just kind of push pause for a second today as it pertains to walking through the stories. And I want to talk specifically about, okay, what is faith? Because that's another thing that this passage is speaking directly to. As a matter of fact, before it goes into that list of individuals who lived lives of faith, it actually talks about what faith is. We find it at the beginning of chapter 11, verse 1. It says this, it says, faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things we cannot actually see. Now, this is coming from the New Living Translation, which is the translation that we typically use here at Hoboken Grace. And to be honest with you, for a long time, I really disliked this verse. I didn't like it at all. I didn't like talking about it. I didn't like teaching on it because it brings to us an idea of faith that didn't seem to line up with the rest of what scriptures say about faith. Now, unfortunately, I think for a lot of us, it lines up with what we think about faith or the way that we would define faith. Let me read it to you again. It says, faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things we cannot see. And oftentimes I would come to this passage and say, really, is that what faith is? Is faith, because we read it and what we walk away from it with is, okay, faith is having confidence that what we hope for will happen. Faith is having confidence that what we can't see is real and what we hope for will happen. I think a lot of us, that's how we define faith. Faith is when you have confidence that what you hope for will happen, which is why some of you were invited here by your friend today. You think faith's ridiculous because you look at that and say, what? What? You just have confidence that what you hope for will happen? That doesn't seem to be a really smart way to live your life. You just have blind confidence that what you hope for will happen. I think a lot of us look at faith that way. And I used to think that when you come to Hebrews chapter 11, that it almost presented faith that way, which I struggle with because I'm like, that's not what faith is to me. And it didn't seem to fit with what the rest of the scriptures taught about faith. But I think a lot of us look at faith that way. There's a local radio station here in our area, a Christian radio station. And they do this thing occasionally where they do these I believe statements. Hopefully you've never heard it. But what they do is they open up the phone lines and then people can call in and they make these statements about what they believe. And so one person will call in and say, I believe that Jesus is God. And the next person calls in and says, I believe that I'm going to have a great day today. And the next person's like, I believe I'm going to get an A on the test. And when I hear it, it makes me throw up in my mouth. Because I think to myself, really? Really? Is my faith in Jesus the same as your faith that you're going to have a good day today? Seriously? Are those two things actually equivalent? Are you telling me the fact that you believe that you're going to get an A on the test is the same belief that you have that Jesus is God? Is that really what this is? Is faith really that we just have confidence that what we hope for is going to happen? For many of us, we actually believe that. We do. Which is why your friend looks at you and says, that's crazy. Which is why you struggle to talk to your friends about faith. Because you're like, I have faith. Well, what is faith? Faith's just, being confident that what you hope for is going to happen. Well, that's you just have confidence in what you hope for? Anybody can do that about anything. Is that really what faith is? I think for a lot of us, we think it is. Which is why we have a really hard time talking to people about faith. And we have a really hard time engaging conversations, especially arguments about faith. Because how do you defend that? You can have a lot of confidence in what you hope for in anything. And I used to struggle with this verse because it almost seems that it's presenting faith as that. It was a couple weeks ago when Anthony did his first conversation on heroes that I began to investigate this further, because in that conversation he read this verse and he read it in a way that I'd never heard it before. And so I said, wait a second, I want to find out what this verse actually says. So with another pastor, I went back because I like to do this with other people. I don't like to be able, when I go back to the Greek, I don't trust myself to be able to do that on my own. I want to be able to get other feedback and hear what other people have to say about it. And so I went back to the original and I looked at it. Okay, what does this actually mean? What is the writer actually saying? And what I found surprised me. I actually discovered something happened to me that had never happened before, because when I went back at it and looked at it, I actually discovered that the best translation of this verse, the best English translation of this verse, is the King James Version Bible. That's never happened to me before. Some of you, you're not aware of what the King James is. It's a very old translation. But when I went to it, I found that the most accurate translation was actually the King James translation. Listen to what it says. It says it this way. It says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Now that's very different than the New Living Translation. The New Living Translation says that faith is the confidence. But when you look at that word in the originals, when you look at that word for what was originally written, it's not the idea of confidence, it's the idea of substance. The definition is the idea of the substance of something, the essence of something, the foundation, the support. Almost like something a foundation that you would build on. Granite, that solid foundation that you would build on. And that next word, the New Living Translation says assurance. It's not the definition is not assurance. The definition is evidence or proof, which is very different. Very different. And as I looked at it, I realized the author's not saying faith is having confidence in what you hope for. The author is actually saying the very opposite of that. It's presenting us with a very different idea of faith. He says, no, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. What he's saying is faith provides us with the substance or the foundation of what it is that we hope for. Faith provides us with the evidence of what we cannot see. Which is why then, as you read through the rest of Hebrews chapter 11, he walks through these different stories. And if you read through it, and I encourage you to do that this week, if you read through it, with each story, he says, we understand this about God. Why? Because this person took this step of faith. And we saw how God interacted with that person, and so we know this about God. And we know this about God because this person took a step of faith, and we've seen how God interacted with him. And he walks through all these different things, and he says, this is how we know God, because of how people have followed him, and God has proven himself faithful, and he has responded and interacted with them. And so we have a foundation for what we hope for. There is evidence for what we cannot see, which is why he gets then to the beginning of chapter 12, and he says, I want you now to live in light of what? What you hope for? No, I want you to live your life in light of the incredible amount of witnesses, the incredible foundation and evidence that you have for who God is. God does not come, listen, because some of you think that God comes to you and asks you to trust him in blind faith. One of the most amazing things about God is that he doesn't do that. He absolutely has the right to do that, but he does not do that to us. He comes to us and he says, I'm going to demonstrate myself to you. I'm going to demonstrate my faithfulness to you. Even with Abraham, he does this. At the beginning of the story, he says, Abraham, take this step, and I'm going to do this. Take this step, and I'm going to do this. Why? He's giving him evidence. He's not asking him to just blindly follow. He's giving him evidence and demonstrating his faithfulness. Why? Because faith is acting on a foundation and evidence of where we've seen God work and how we've seen God move. Faith is not just hoping and having confidence in some hope that you have. That is not God's definition of faith. And so he comes to us, he says, look at the foundation, look at the substance, look at what you can see and touch and feel, and look at the evidence that we've seen in the lives of those who have come before us, and follow Jesus based on that. Listen, I do not follow Jesus because I hope that it's true. I follow Jesus because Jesus predicted his death and resurrection, and then he did it. I don't just blindly follow him because I hope that it's true. I follow him based on what actually happened. When you look at the launch of the church, and when you read through the book of Acts, what is it that they're saying over and over and over again? They're calling people to follow Jesus. Why? Because you hope that it's true? No, they're saying it constantly. Listen, they killed him and he came back to life. They killed him and he came back to life. Why is it that it takes off? Because so many people saw him come back to life. One of the most powerful examples of this is the writer James. Now, many of you don't realize this. There's a letter inside of the New Testament that's written by an individual named James. Many of you don't realize this. James was actually Jesus' brother. Some of you don't know that Jesus had siblings. He actually had multiple siblings, one of which was James. Now, the interesting thing about James is that James didn't believe that Jesus was God for most of his life because he was his brother. Imagine what your brother would have to do to convince you that he was God. And for most of his life, James looked at Jesus and said, no, until Jesus came back from the dead. And when Jesus came back from the dead, things changed for James. If your brother came back from the dead, I'm betting things would change for you. One of the most powerful witnesses to Jesus and his resurrection is James. And James didn't believe in Jesus because he hoped that it was true. He believed it based on what he had seen. This is one of the really powerful things about the explosion of the church. Sometimes people look at the beginning of the book of Acts and say, 3,000 people came to know Christ in the first day. That's crazy. It's not really. Most of them had seen Jesus come back from the dead. One of the powerful things about the beginning of the church is that it began days after Christ goes back to be with the Father. Most world religions begin decades, if not centuries, after their leader has died. You know why? They gain traction then. You know why? Because no one's alive to be able to say, that didn't actually happen. No, they weren't actually like that. All the people who knew them are dead. But the church begins days after Jesus goes to be with the Father. And it sweeps through the country like wildfire. Why? Because everyone had actually seen it. And they didn't believe it because they hoped that it was true. They didn't have confidence because they hoped that it was true. They saw it. God's not coming to you and saying, hey, hope that this is true. Here's what faith is. Have confidence and hope that this is true. That's not what God's doing. God comes to us over and over again and says, look what I did. 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 You don't have to have blind faith in me. I'm going to show you. Look what I did. Your faith is not just confidence in something you hope for. There's substance. There's evidence. He's saying, look what I did. And he understands, you can't see me, but you can see the impact of me. And we understand this in life. How many of you believe in protons? You know what a proton is? Hopefully you know what a proton is. How many, like 4 of you believe in protons? You should go back to school. Next week, come back, look it up, see what it is. Maybe you'll remember 5th grade when they taught you about it because it's kind of basic, really important to our understanding of the world around us. It determines a lot of what we do in science, understanding this. Now, how many of you have ever seen a proton? None of you have seen a proton. You know how many living beings have seen a proton? 0. Now, someone came up to me afterwards and he was arguing with me about whether or not he's seen a proton because you can see a proton cloud and there's a lot of different aspects to this, but no one has actually ever seen a proton. If you want to have that conversation, talk to Justin after the service. But why do we believe in protons? Why do we know that they're there? We don't just believe in them. No one's like, oh, I have faith in protons. No, we say, no, protons exist. They're real. Why? Because we can interact with them. And we see the impact of them. And we do certain things, and we see them respond in certain ways. God says, I don't want you to just blindly believe in something. As a matter of fact, throughout the scriptures, God's constantly saying, you need to test, you need to prove what you believe in. Don't just blindly hope in something. For those of you who have been looking at faith and saying that's ridiculous, God says the same thing about that kind of faith, that you just blindly hope in something. No. And the writer's coming to us and saying, faith doesn't have anything to do with how you feel. Faith is when you act on what God has said. It's when you follow Jesus based on who God has proven himself to be throughout this entire story. Based on how God has proven himself in the lives of all these different individuals and all these different places and all these different circumstances, based on how Jesus walked out of that tomb, based on how Jesus is continuing to prove himself to be exactly who he says in the lives of the people who are sitting right next to you. One of the reasons why we do stories all the time here at Hoboken Grace is for you to be able to see the evidence and the substance of what it is that we hope for and what we cannot see. But we have to change the way that we think about faith. We have to change the way that we talk about faith. Please stop trying to convince your friends to have confidence in something that you just hope for. Hopefully, you can't convince them to do that. That's not what we do. That's not what it means to follow Jesus. That's not how our God defines faith. We have to change the way that we think about it, the way that we talk about it. To call people, no, I want to invite you to follow Jesus based on what Jesus has done. And the amazing way that God is continuing to prove himself in the world around us all the time. Change the way that we think about it, change the way that we talk about it. But then also, the power of this passage is twofold. One is it challenges the way that we think about faith. But then the entire point of the passage is an invitation. He's calling them to something. He's helping them to understand that, no. Faith is what has allowed, faith is built on the evidence of what God has done and the consistency and the substance of what God has done in the past. He says, but then also, when you take steps of faith, you provide that evidence and substance for others. What he's helping them to see is, listen, if you just step back and take it comfortable, you rob the people around you of the evidence and substance of who God is for them to be able to step out in faith. And so he's saying, now, in light of what they have provided for you, you live in such a way that you provide it for others. When you step out in faith, it provides substance and evidence for the people around you of who God is. It provides a footing for their faith, a foundation for their faith. So many of you experienced this. The foundation for your faith was how you saw God work in the lives of the people around you. I say to people all the time, as I grew up, there were times that I doubted whether or not God was good, but I never doubted whether or not God was there. Why? Because the faith of my parents, I had seen them take steps of faith and watch God interact with their lives. It's like watching that proton experiment. You know it's there. And their faith provided that foundation, that substance, that evidence for my faith. There's no way that I could doubt whether or not he's there. I've seen it. When you take steps of faith, that's what you do for the people around you. You give them a footing for their faith. You build on the amazing foundation that Jesus has established for our faith. You bring it into their life in a personal way. So when we're talking about, we're walking through, okay, how do we see the faith that these individuals lived with, and how do we bring that into our lives? This is about more than just, okay, how do we make better decisions? This is about how do we fill our city? How do we fill our workplaces? How do our neighborhoods become constant examples? How do they become full of substance and proof, evidence of who God is? So that the world might know. So that the world might know that there's substance to what we hope for. So the world might be able to see evidence of what it is that they can't see. That's the invitation. That's what we get to be a part of. For some of us, we need to reestablish our faith on the foundation that God called us to establish it on. If you continue to believe that your faith is just having confidence in what you hope for, it's going to be shaky, and eventually it will be undermined and taken from you. Because that's not the faith that God calls you to have. And for you to reestablish it on, no, Jesus was a real person who really died and really came back from the dead. And there were people who saw it. And the reality of what God's doing in the world around you and the lives of the people who are sitting right next to you, reestablish that. And then begin to move into our lives in such a way that we provide that footing for others. That the truth of who God is, even though we cannot see him, will be seen everywhere. That's what faith's all about. Will you pray with me? Father, as we walk through this and as we look at how you're challenging our understanding of faith, I pray that this would be an incredible encouragement for those who are struggling with faith because of the fact that they've just had the wrong definition. Father, I pray that it would overwhelm us with the reality that you have not called us to just believe in a vacuum, in a void, but that you and your love and your grace and your mercy have stepped in to be able to say, no, this is who I am. Watch, look at what I'm doing. Look at what I'm doing. Look at what I'm doing. Father, I pray that we would be able to reestablish, to root our faith in the amazing way that you've demonstrated yourself, both through your Son and in the lives of all of those who've come before us. And then as a result, we also would follow you. And the world would see more and more and more. Our community would be saturated by the substance and the evidence of who you are. In Jesus' name, amen.